Hello everybody and welcome to the round glass review for the Zhongyi Mitakon 20mm f2.0 4X through 4.5X super macro lens. So right up front, for fun with this video as a one-off, I'm going to show each photo, each still image, and then I'm going to let you see if you can guess what each of the still images are. Halfway through each image, I'm going to indicate what it's actually a photo of. So keep track of that. And after you watch the video, drop a comment with how many of them you get correct. This lens is made by Zhongyi. It went into production in 2017. According to Amazon, it was first available for sale on September 6th, 2017. And also it is currently, as of the end of 2021, still for sale new on Mitakon's website. Typical lens uses for this are limited exclusively to super macros for things like scientific, medical, and possibly some forensic work, although realistically, scientific and forensic work are probably going to have more specialized and far more expensive tools. Now, if you're new to this series, there won't be any test charts or situations that intentionally set this lens up to succeed or fail. These reviews are based on real-world use and aim to provide images and, where applicable, video that mimics how you are likely to actually use this lens. One other quick note. You're going to notice that a lot of the images in this video, and probably also some of the actual video footage, has sensor dust. With magnifications like this lens provides, the light that reaches the sensor is functionally parallel, and that amplifies sensor dust on images even wide open. Stopping down to f8 or a usable aperture like that greatly amplifies the amount of dust that shows up in your images with this lens. And I point that out because every time I used this lens, I went out of my way to clean my sensors with a brush and a lighted loupe, and still dust. Giving you nothing whatsoever that isn't common knowledge, the focal length and angle of view on this, well, the focal length is 20 millimeters. The AOV is rather hard to calculate given the extreme image magnification. So yes, this is a 20 millimeter lens, and no, it will not take ultra-wide angle landscape images for you. And yes, the angle of view on the image that reaches the sensor is something like a low double-digit number of degrees. That was the closest I could get, but I couldn't get the exact AOV. The aperture range is f2.0 to f16. There is no filter ability with this lens. It cannot take filters. The closest focus is fixed at 18.5 millimeters for the 4x magnification setting, and 17 millimeters for the 4.5x magnification, and that's from the front of the lens. The front element sits some millimeters back from the front of the lens itself. It is manual focus only. Well, that's not exactly correct. It's manual magnification adjustment only because, as I just noted, the focus point is fixed, so you can't focus the lens. You can scroll through magnifications, which adjusts what's actually in focus, but it increases or decreases the magnification at the same time. So there's not a focus as you would think about it with most lenses with this lens. For systems available, the lens is available in a ton of mounts. Now, I own it in Pentax K, and I used it on both full frame and APS-C. The latter, with and without a speed booster, though I don't think any of the APS-C non-speed booster images made it into this video. At least I don't see them in my folder right now. In addition to Pentax K, Zhongyi released this for Canon EF, Nikon F, Sony A, Fuji X, Micro Four Thirds, and Sony E as well. Whether going forward there will be other EOS R and Nikon Z mounts, I don't know. The best I can say is that as of this video's recording, they aren't listed on Mitakon's website. For weight, the Amazon catalog page here provides conflicting information. I'm going to help you sort it out a bit. Simultaneously, the Amazon catalog indicates that all of the lens mounts are 230 grams. But it also indicates that only the DSLR mounts are 230 grams while the mirrorless mounts are 699 grams. So I'm going to say that the latter is probably true. Now, I have not used or owned this lens in a native mirrorless mount, but when you go to a mirrorless mount versus DSLR, the lens housing will need to be longer to cover that mirrorless camera's shorter register distance, which means more metal and more weight. Now, as a sidebar, knowing this has mirrorless mount options, I kind of want to buy one and put it on the Pentax K flange and obtain even more magnification. I mean, I'm not, but I want to. Zhongyi does not provide a diagram for this lens, but it does note that it's 6 elements in 4 groups. Now, I suspect, based on shining a point source light from a bright focused flashlight into the lens from both sides, with the aperture closed, that the lens is comprised of 2 triplets and that they are close to, if not identical, and in reversed orientation. If true, that design would do a lot to control the major image aberrations this lens would exhibit when used at extreme magnifications, so it makes sense that that would be how they'd lay it out. For sharpness, I'm not going to lie, it's way better than I expected. I thought this lens was going to be super soft, but it's not. Now, it is a hair softer than many lenses, but given the magnification levels, it's also to be expected. Lenses become softer when you magnify them past the point that they're really designed to be. So this lens is far sharper at 4 to 4 times magnification than most lenses would be when racked out on a bellows far enough to be magnifying 4 to 4.5 times. For build quality, it is very good overall. Now, the mount does not like adapters, or at least I should say my lens does not like adapters, and rear caps can sometimes float a bit on that lens's mount. The magnification increasing ring, which is like a focus ring in the way it operates, is a bit stiffer than I would like, and what that means is that for video, if you rack your magnification while using this for video, you will get subject shake, period, end of story, especially at the magnifications this lens delivers. Now, all that said, the magnification stiffness that is built into this lens would really help a lot with top-down macro work for things like stamps and coins and so forth. The housing is all metal, and it feels very solid. The aperture ring is smooth and has an appropriate amount of damping. Now, I will say that even though the interior of the lens is felt lined, I have still gotten hot spots in images sometimes, though admittedly that tends to be mostly when working with a speed booster. The aperture shape is triangular owing to the 3-bladed aperture, and this definitely will show up in your images. And because of that aperture shape, out-of-focus area characteristics are mixed. If you have a reflective subject, you will have triangular specular highlights. Or if you have light in the background from a source point, you will have specular triangular highlights. Same thing if you have light that reflects off of fine or shiny bits of your subject. Now, given that you really do need to stop this lens down, as we'll talk about in a minute, you will have those triangular highlights or out-of-focus area characteristics a lot. Really isolating your subjects can help, by which I mean giving your subjects as much distance as possible to whatever is behind them. And that's going to help minimize the distracting triangles of confusion. For the lens's design flaws, to highlight how well this lens controls distortion, because that's easy to do, here are some super macros of graph paper. There is some light loss, softness, and field curvature is noticeable with this lens when wide open on flat subjects. And that's especially true on the image peripheries for all of that. However, by f8, those issues are rectified. By no coincidence, I'm sure, f8 is the widest aperture at which you should use this lens anyway. The only real flaw this lens overtly exhibited for me was hot spotting, and again, let me stress that happened in a very specific setting, with light immediately off frame, up and to the side. Hot spotting disappeared when I relocated the light by a few inches. So basically, the whole point of that is don't shoot this lens wider than f8, and also be mindful of your lighting and be in a setting where you can adjust it, because that's going to help set you up for the best results you can get. For your balance with your camera, the lens does have some heft, but it will balance well with either a DSLR or mirrorless camera. If you have an APS-C mirrorless and are shooting with a DSLR mount copy, a speed booster will make your camera, at least to me, uncomfortably front heavy. So much of the standard video subjects in my template are going to be NA for this lens, and using it for video was hard. Now there's no focus breathing, nor anything else focus related, honestly. I did find the magnification ring, as I mentioned, a bit stiff, and I think that would make this lens very hard to use for video if you are racking through the magnification. And it also has a relatively short magnification ring throw of 105 degrees. And yes, I did buy a full circle protractor to get accurate numbers for those readings now. And the other issues I would have with this lens's use in video, we've by and large discussed. There is one other one, which is that any kind of movement in your subject or any movement in your lens at all, whether you're adjusting the aperture, bump the tripod with your toe, whatever, it doesn't matter. It will translate because the angle of view on this is so narrow. It's not like using a wide angle lens. It's more like using a 1,000 or 1,200 millimeter telescope. The more that you narrow down your angle of view, the more that minor bumps or air movements that touch the leaves of a blade of grass or something like that will show up in your finished product. Now, I will note that this lens could have some excellent potential as a video lens for the right subject setting and video objective. Now, I don't simply mean video footage of ants or whatever, but if you want to do something that's uncomfortably close, or with high magnification like a pupil dilating or sweat beading through a pore, this lens could probably do that. Couple of remaining notes. The aperture is stepless, and the front element, though non-rotating as you increase magnification, does extend about 15 millimeters when you increase magnification. That said, since you can't mount a filter on this lens, it probably doesn't matter that much. Here are some additional clips showing you things like scrolling through the magnification range with this lens and so forth, to give you an idea of what this lens does as a video lens. Here's the best tip for you with this lens. Work exclusively indoors with a solid tripod, steady state lighting, and good control of your subject and light, also ensuring that your subject isn't moving unless it's alive and you have tons of light. Here's the second best tip that I have for you. Before you buy this lens, master focus stacking using a studio or tabletop setup and a macro focusing rail, not focusing through your lens's range to do focus stacking. You need to master it with a macro focusing rail. This lens lacks focus control and only focuses at a set point. You need to master being able to move your camera in and out for focus stacking. And yes, adjusting the magnification between shots will mess up your images, because 4 to 4.5 times magnification is a lot of difference, and it will distort your final image stack. One other quick note, none of the images in this video are done with image stacking, for the simple fact that I wanted the images in this video to reflect what the lens does out of the box. So the focus point and working distance on this lens shift a lot when you change magnification. So it's not like a zoom lens that will zoom into something. And just be aware of that when you use this lens for video or when you've got it mounted on a tripod, that's just a different function than you've probably ever run across before. Also, the depth of field is super narrow. So here are 4 image sets. Now the first of each set is going to be at 4x, and then the second of an identical set of images will be at 4.5x. There are the same 4 image sequences, and there are 6 images in each: f2, f2.8, f5.6, f8, f11, and f16. These image sets were designed to show you how narrow the depth of field is at each magnification level, as well as how the depth of field is angled across a flat image plane, how the depth of field changes with aperture, and how things like illumination and field curvature change with aperture. Now, I marked the images with the as shot aperture in the same place for every image to help illustrate exactly what it is you're seeing in each one. This demonstration, I think more than any other, should really show how incredibly hard this lens is to use. I think that one of the most telling series in this sets of images is the staples. In the 4X series, the alignment was a bit off, but you can see that the depth of field goes from about 1.5 staples to about 3 or 4. But in the 4.5 times magnification series, which is aligned much better, the depth of field goes from 1 staple to, by the time we're at f16, 2 staples. If you've ever held a standard staple, this, I think, will illustrate how impossibly thin this lens's depth of field is, regardless of your aperture. Also, I thought when I went into starting to use this lens that it would be ideal on a speed booster. In fact, I bought my first speed booster specifically to use it with this lens. But you know what? It's not. In fact, this lens, it's kind of awful on a speed booster. There's the issue with hotspots, but also there's the added weight of the speed booster, and that makes it really hard to use this lens on smaller APS-C cameras. And by smaller, I basically mean anything. The speed booster made this front heavy when I used this lens on an A6400, which is not a light camera by APS-C mirrorless standards. As for your photo types that are easiest to achieve successfully with this lens, they include solely and exclusively super macro images. Note that this lens is not a microscope. Macro photography begins at 1:1 magnification, meaning that the image on your imaging plane is the same size as the real life thing. So a millimeter measurement in real life translates at 1:1 to a millimeter of sensor space on your digital sensor. Microscopy begins at 20:1 image magnification. There's no real definition I know of for super macro, so when Zhongyi calls this lens a super macro, yes, okay, it goes well beyond 1:1, but the term super macro, it's really just marketing babble. You can trust me on that. I've worked in marketing for 2 decades. I know marketing babble very well. As for subjects not to photograph this lens, within the bounds of the magnification, the only suggestion I have for you is not to digitize your negatives with a quadrillion images and then set your computer on fire stitching them together. Yes, you can make out-grain clumps with this lens at 4.5x, but that won't make your film digitizing any better. Also, to fend off a question, no, you cannot make out individual film crystals. That requires an electron scanning microscope. For metering, I liked spot with central framing. Now, there's not much you can do except central framing with this lens, to be honest, but spot metering will help you obtain accurate readings on uniformly toned subjects. For subjects with much contrast, that did require full scene metering. But if you have a subject, let's say like a tooth, in the center of your frame, center weighted's going to work very well. The Zhongyi Mitakon 20mm f2 4 through 4.5 times magnification super macro lens is hard to use. If you have not used other macro lenses before and used them a lot at that, this lens should definitely not be your first macro lens. This lens is very hard to use. The magnification, because of the rule of inverse squares, means that even in full sun, you will have a hard time obtaining sharp images with lower sensitivity. What do I mean? Well, in full sun, wide open, your shutter speed will be approximately your sensitivity. With this lens, I had recorded camera movements and image shake to 1/400th of a second because increasing magnification increases camera movement blur. Just in the same way that using a telephoto lens, like a 500mm versus a 50mm, increases the amount of blur that happens at the slower shutter speeds when you're hand holding them. So to bring this all back to the best tip that I had for you earlier, my best work with this lens was done indoors, tripod mounted with a single light source, sometimes a matte white reflector, which, let me clarify, means a sheet of copy paper, and a timer or remote control to eliminate shutter release shake on the camera. And the next tip I have for you was to master focus stacking before you buy this lens. And as I mentioned, I did not do any focus stacking for this video because that wouldn't really look at this lens's performance as it is out of the box, but would be looking at my skill with macro focus stacking. That's not what this video is about. All of this is because even stop down, like I mentioned, as we saw with the staples, the depth of field is so thin that you will want to use focus stacking. And for that, again, because of how high the magnification is with this lens and because it lacks focusing ability, you really must use a macro rail to scroll your whole camera through the focusing range to capture your images for focus stacking. And now, if you are a macro photographer and you are really, really into your focus stacking, you're already familiar with that technique. If you don't know what I'm talking about with that, this lens, it's not for you yet. But what this lens does, the thing that it does well. If you want to document small valuables like gemstones, coins, or stamps, if you want to analyze microcircuits, or if you want to see up close how an eye or a muscle structure looks, then this lens could be very good for that. Just be aware that the handling is hard to learn and the working distances are so short that most subjects don't work with this lens. It cannot even fit an entire bee in the frame. That's a lot of magnification. In the world of specialists, the Zhongyi Mitakon 20mm f2 super macro lens sets the definition for specialist design. This lens barges into a room like the Kool-Aid Man, oh yeah, and does the one thing it can do. But here's the real deal. Limitations increase creativity. Forcing yourself to work within a limited set of confines causes your brain to examine alternative possibilities, other ways to use the tools you have at your disposal. At the best, this leads inexorably and unstoppably, like gravity on a skydiver, to your mind asking, what if I tried this thing? When that happens, that's like an acorn of creativity, and nourished, that question can grow thousands-fold over. So when I say this lens does the one thing it can do, I don't mean that it magnifies stuff a lot. Of course it does that. But what this lens really does, if you let it, if you work with it, is force you to try new things, to explore new ways of creatively expressing what you want to say with your work. So if you do get this lens, embrace that element of it. See what you can put in front of it. How can you light things to make them appear more interesting or different when they are that highly magnified? And how can you use super macro images to better tell the stories you want to tell in your photographs?